So my name is Katie Taylor, and I am a program officer at the National Center for Special Education Research, which I'll refer to as NCSER. And today I'll be talking about the research training programs in special education, and specifically the postdoctoral research training program in special education and early intervention. So here's the agenda for today's webinar. First, I'll give you a brief intro to IES and to NCSER in particular. Then I'll give an overview of the research training programs and discuss the specifics of the postdoctoral training program. And then finally, I'll end with the application submission and review process, so you'll have an idea of what to do when you're writing and submitting an application, and then also what the peer review process will be like. So I'll start by providing a bit of background on IES. IES is the independent research arm of the U.S. Department of Education, and its overall mission is to describe the condition and progress of education in the U.S., identify education practices that improve academic achievement and access to educational opportunities, and evaluate the effectiveness of federal and other education programs. IES is comprised of a National Board of Education Sciences, a Standards and Review Office, which oversees the peer review process, and 4 centers. The National Center for Education Evaluation, or NCEE, conducts large-scale evaluations of education programs and supports the development and use of research and evaluation throughout the U.S. And the National Center for Education Statistics, or NCES, is responsible for collecting and analyzing data related to education in the U.S. and other nations. And then there are the 2 research centers, so the National Center for Education Research, or NCER, and the National Center for Special Education Research, or NCSER. And these are where the grant programs are housed. So both research centers sponsor rigorous research to address education problems in the U.S. The differences between the two are that NCR supports research focused on pre-kindergartners through adults, whereas NCSER supports research on children birth through grade 12, and NCSER also has a focus on students with disabilities. So another thing I want to point out here is that the research centers are separate from the Standards and Review Office, which oversees the peer review process. And this separation allows the program officers in NCER and NCSER to work closely with applicants on their proposals. Okay, so the objectives of the IES grant programs are to improve education outcomes for all students, particularly those at risk for school failure. And the grant programs do this by developing or identifying education interventions that enhance academic achievement and can be widely deployed, by identifying what works and what does not work and encouraging further research and innovation, and by understanding the processes that underlie the effectiveness of education interventions and the variations in their effectiveness. Okay, turning the attention to NCSER specifically, as I mentioned, NCSER sponsors a rigorous and comprehensive program of special education research designed to expand the knowledge and understanding of infants, toddlers, and students with or at risk for disabilities from birth through high school. The NCSER is different from the other research center because of our disability focus and the age range of students that are research targets. Okay, now I'll provide a brief overview of NCSER's research training programs. So the purpose of these programs is to prepare individuals to conduct rigorous and relevant special education and early intervention research that advances knowledge within the field and addresses issues that are important to education, policymakers, and practitioners. Okay, on to the postdoctoral research training program specifically. So I'll cover the purpose of this program, the specific requirements in the request for applications, or the RFA, things to put in your narrative, the appendices, and the budget limitations for this particular program. The postdoctoral training program supports programs that prepare education researchers to conduct high-quality, independent special education and early intervention research that advances knowledge within the field and addresses issues that are important to education policymakers and practitioners. And it's intended to support the training of fellows who have high potential but may need more research experience and mentoring before launching their independent careers. So training programs should provide practical, hands-on experiences, enrichment of theoretical and empirical knowledge, and opportunities to build professional skills and networks that will support working with other researchers and with practitioners, policymakers, and other education stakeholders. And IES also encourages postdoctoral training programs to include opportunities for fellows to work closely with state and local education policymakers and practitioners in designing and conducting their research projects. The awards themselves cannot be made for more than 5 years and have a budget maximum of $766,000 total. So this total includes the direct and indirect costs. So I need to stress here that you must adhere to these maximums, the duration and the budget maximums, in your application, or your application will not be forwarded for review. So just make sure that you don't even go $1 over the budget maximum. And then please also note that for training awards, there is an indirect cost rate cap of 8%, and the indirect costs cannot be applied to participant support costs, which include direct support for fellows. So indirect costs are only on the program expenses, and this is described in greater detail in the RFA. And awards, postdoc training program awards will be given as cooperative agreements, which involves a partnership between the PI and also IES. So in terms of the training program focus, the program must address early intervention or special education and include a combination of at least one of the 11 research topics and at least one of the 5 research goals from the Institute's Special Education Research RFA. Here are the 11 research topics that are covered in our Special Education Research Grants RFA. So autism spectrum disorders, cognition and student learning in special education, early intervention and early learning in special education, families of children with disabilities, math and science education, professional development, reading, writing, and language development, social and behavioral outcomes to support learning, special education policy, finance, and systems, technology for special education, and transition outcomes for secondary students with disabilities. And the other thing to consider is the research goals. The goal or goals represent the type of work that you intend to train fellows to do, or the type of research being conducted as part of your ongoing projects that fellows may work on. So the 5 research goals include Goal 1, exploration, Goal 2, development and innovation, Goal 3, efficacy and replication, Goal 4, effectiveness, and Goal 5, measurement. And at the bottom of the slide, you see there's a link to the Special Education Research Grant website, so you can see more information about each of these goals. But briefly, the exploration goal supports the investigation of relations between malleable factors and student education outcomes. The development and innovation goal supports the development of a new intervention or a modification of an existing intervention and pilot testing to determine whether it's usable and feasible and has promise for improving student education outcomes. The advocacy and replication goal supports initial evaluations of interventions that are either in wide use or have not been rigorously evaluated, or have evidence of promise for improving student education outcomes, as well as replications of interventions with prior evidence of efficacy. And the effectiveness goal supports studies to test the impact of fully developed interventions when they're implemented under routine conditions and evaluated by an independent evaluator. And then lastly, the measurement goal supports the development, modification, and validation of new or existing assessments. So as part of the postdoctoral program, there are several requirements. And the first set of requirements pertains to the academic institution. So the academic institution must be located in the territorial U.S. and confer doctoral degrees in relevant fields to special education or early intervention. And the institution may hold more than one postdoc training award through the IES postdoctoral programs. However, each training program has to have a different set of key personnel and a different training focus. So there cannot be any overlap of key personnel or the training focus in more than one postdoc program at an academic institution. And then academic institutions can partner with another institution that will provide fellows with research opportunities that are aligned with the program's focus. Okay, in terms of the key personnel requirements, all researcher mentors, whether the PI or the co-PI or any other associated mentors, are to be considered key personnel and must be named and listed as key personnel in the grant application. So co-PIs or other researcher mentors can be from non-academic institutions that conduct rigorous special education or early intervention research. So it may be that there's a research organization that is close to you in proximity or close to you in topic area, and you may want to partner with that institution to give your fellows a different view of conducting research related to special education or early intervention. And then all key personnel must be working on at least one special education or early intervention research project currently supported by IES or another funding source. And these projects should be appropriate for postdoctoral level research training, and all projects combined must provide training opportunities for the fellows for at least the first 2 years of the training grant. And then lastly, key personnel can take part in only one IES-funded postdoc training program at a time, regardless of whether that program is funded by the National Center for Special Education Research or the National Center for Education Research. So these are the requirements for the postdoctoral fellows. If you receive an award under the postdoctoral training program topic, you will have to certify that your training participants or fellows meet the following requirements. So first, their research must be relevant to special education or early intervention in the U.S. They must be U.S. citizens or permanent residents, and they must have received their doctorate prior to beginning the fellowship. Grant funds that are expended on fellows who do not meet these requirements will be disallowed. Okay, now on to the basic requirements for the proposal. So the 4 sections that need to be explicitly addressed in the proposal are the significance, research training plan, personnel, and resources. I'm going to go into detail in these 4 areas in the next few slides. So the purpose of the significance section is to describe the training program's focus and potential contribution to the field and how it will develop researchers who are capable of conducting high-quality scientific research. So in your application, we ask you to describe and justify the focus of your training program. So this means how is it related to special education and early intervention? And how is it related to the goals and to the topics that I described earlier? We also ask you to discuss how the program is going to develop researchers that are capable of conducting high-quality research. So you should discuss the characteristics, interests, and needs of the fellows that you're likely to recruit. And by doing this, you'll be better able to discuss the types of training that are required to produce the intended type of researchers. Then you should also discuss what the fellows will be doing, what sort of training will be provided, and what types of opportunities fellows will have to work in partnership with education policymakers and practitioners in designing and conducting their research. And your description should make it clear how the work you'll be doing will lead to a new crop of researchers that are capable of conducting high-quality research that is useful to education stakeholders. And lastly, you should also describe the program's potential contribution to the overall field. So what skills and knowledge will be taught by your training program, and how are they important to special education or early intervention research and practice? The research training plan should outline the specific activities your training program will provide. In your narrative, you must describe a recruitment plan, research training activities for each fellow, the financial support for fellows in the program, and a plan for tracking fellows' progress and determining the success of the program. So in terms of the recruitment plan, you should describe its major elements, including how you plan to find a diverse group of fellows, so fellows from underrepresented groups, fellows who have high potential but may need more research, experience, and mentoring, and fellows from multiple disciplines. And then you'll also discuss the criteria which you will use to select fellows. And then in terms of your description of the training activities, you should discuss the roles that postdoc fellows will have on the mentor's research grants and the focus of those grants, the opportunities fellows will have to work with policymakers and practitioners, and other training activities that fellows will receive. And then the financial support section should describe the allocation of funds for directly supporting the fellows, as well as use of the program funds. And then lastly, you should discuss how you will assess fellows' initial areas of strength and need, how you'll track their progress, and the measures that you'll use to assess the success of fellows and the program. In the personnel section, you'll want to provide information about your training team, including their expertise, their current and previous research projects, responsibilities, time commitments, and past success mentoring fellows, collaborating with policymakers and practitioners, and disseminating research. And then the final thing that you need to include in your training program narrative is a resources section. And this section should show that the institutions involved have access to the resources needed to conduct the training. So whether it's at the primary site where the training program will take place, or if it's at the other partner institutions. So if you're partnering with other academic institutions or non-academic institutions, you should also describe the resources there. And then you should also describe any partnerships you have with schools, agencies, or organizations that would provide fellows with opportunities to work with education policymakers and practitioners. Also, the ongoing special education research projects that fellows are likely to work on, and the success of any previous postdoctoral training grants that you or other researcher mentors have had from IES. Okay, so this is the table of all of the required and optional appendices. So this is another key part of your application. And certain materials must be provided in the appendices to support the training program narrative. Appendix A is not applicable to the postdoc programs, so no material should be included here. If your application is a resubmission, you must include your response to the previous reviewers in Appendix B. In Appendix C, you must provide a summary table of the ongoing special education or early intervention research projects that the researcher mentors are PIs or co-PIs on. In this appendix, you should also include a summary table of any current or previous IES-funded postdoc programs. And the RFA includes a detailed description of the information that should be provided in these tables. Appendix D is also required and should include an example of the letter of agreement, which outlines the conditions of the fellowship and will be signed by the PI and each postdoc fellow prior to the acceptance of the position. Appendix E is also required and must include letters of agreement from any other involved departments or outside partners showing their agreement to be part of the training program, and provide research opportunities to the fellows. And then lastly, Appendix F is optional, but it can be used to include examples of training materials and tables and charts that support the training program narrative, such as a timeline, table of training activities, seminars, etc. So here we describe some of the additional budget parameters for the postdoc programs. So these requirements will not be used in determining responsiveness to the RFA. However, applications that are recommended for funding will be required to meet these requirements. So grant funds provided for direct support of fellows may include a $60,000 stipend per fellow for up to 3 years, and also up to $25,000 per fellow per year that can be used for fringe benefits, training activities, and travel to the IES annual meeting in Washington, D.C. In addition, up to $16,000 can be used for program expenses. So these can include things like recruitment costs, the PI's travel to the IES PI meeting in D.C., costs of tracking the progress of fellows and the success of the program, any administrative support that the program might need, and honoraria for speakers for fellows as part of your fellowship program. Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about today is the application submission and the peer review process. All important dates and deadlines are included in the RFA. So we encourage you to submit a letter of intent if you're interested in applying. These are optional, so if you don't submit a letter, you can still submit an application. However, I'd still encourage you to email me with a brief description of your training program and just let me know that you intend to apply. And then be sure to leave yourself plenty of time to submit your application, as we do not accept late applications. Okay, now let's talk about how to apply. So there is an IES application process webinar, and in that webinar, IES staff will go into much more depth about the application process. But for now, I'll just talk broadly about how it works. So you'll need 2 things to apply. First, you need the RFA, which contains information for writing your training program narrative, as well as other information related to submitting. And then you'll also need the application package, and this can be found on grants.gov. So here's a screenshot of grants.gov where you can find and download the application package. In terms of registration for grants.gov, the first tip, and perhaps the most important, is to start this process early. So initial registration can take more than 5 business days. And grants.gov actually recommends allowing 4 weeks to register. Even if you're already registered, the annual update that you have to complete could take more than 3 days. So as I said, just be sure to start this process early and leave yourself plenty of time. And then it's actually your institution that needs to register, so not you as an individual. And for most institutions, the Sponsored Projects Office will take care of the registration if it hasn't already been done. But you just want to make sure to check in with them to ensure that it's been completed. And then applications received by grants.gov are date and time stamped to the second. So your application must be fully uploaded and submitted, and the date and time must be stamped no later than the deadline that's specified in the RFA. So once you've successfully submitted your application, it will go through the peer review process. And the first step in this process is screening for compliance and responsiveness to the RFA. So compliance screening is related to adherence to the application rules. So for example, completion of all parts of the application and inclusion of the required appendices. Responsiveness, on the other hand, involves determining whether you adhere to the requirements of the competition. So these are the components that are the minimum necessary to be sent forward for peer review. And if your application is found to be both responsive and compliant, Then you'll be assigned to a review panel, and 2 to 3 panel members will conduct a primary review of your application and provide feedback about the application. Then once a primary review of each application has occurred, the most competitive applications are then forwarded for review by the full panel of reviewers. So during the panel review, applications are discussed and then rated by all reviewers on the panel. And from that point, we make funding decisions and then contact all applicants, giving them statements from the reviewers so that those who did not receive funding can potentially resubmit if we repeat the competition in subsequent years. And if you want to learn more about the peer review process, then you can follow this link to find more information from the Standards and Review Office, who oversees this process. So in terms of notification, you will be notified whether or not you've received funding for your application. The notification comes through the applicant notification system, and that system is one that you get prompted to sign up for once you've submitted your application. Or if you've submitted before, you should already have an account. And it provides you with information about the status of the award, and then when summary statements of reviewer comments are released, it provides you with those as well. So if you're not granted an award the first time, I'd encourage you to review your summary statement and talk to me to get some insight into what you can do differently and ways to think about the reviewer comments to help you improve your application. And another thing I want to encourage you to do is to go to our website and look at the resources page. This page provides links to different trainings and other information and content that could help you improve your application. And in addition, there are a number of webinars that you could benefit from, and you can find these webinars on our website as well. So just some reminders: make sure you attend to the budget and grant period limits. Make sure you also attend to the materials that should be included in the appendices, as well as the recommendations to improve the quality and competitiveness of your application. And lastly, read the request for applications really carefully. And also email me early on if you want to schedule a phone call to talk more in depth about your proposal or ask quick questions about your training program or your ideas. And then as long as it's within a reasonable time frame, I can review drafts of your proposal or parts and pieces of your proposal and provide feedback. Here's a link to the funding page and also my email address. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you all for participating today.